Hi, this is Mark from ITCU Solutions, and today I just want to show you how to configure a Cisco small business switch. The particular switch we're looking at today is a Cisco 220, and there's a lot of reasons you might want to look at a Cisco small business switch. The biggest reasons we're looking at it have started using them is that the cheaper enterprise Cisco switches, such as the Cisco 9200 series, are basically requiring you to also purchase an Essentials license today, and it's just driving the cost up. So one way we've kind of got around this is for our clients that prefer the Cisco command line or are familiar with Cisco's, using a small business switch gives you a very similar instruction set, at least from the command line. So today I just want to show you actually how to configure one of these switches from the command line for people in this situation. And the first thing you probably should do when you configure one of these from the command line is actually use the console cable. And the way you do that is just open up your terminal emulator, such as PuTTY, create your serial connection. The one thing I've found in the small business series, unlike the enterprise, the speed is not 9600, despite the fact that most of the manuals will tell you it is. It's actually 115/200 by default. For other reasons, I'm not actually going to use the console port today. I'm actually just going to telnet, or actually I'm going to telnet from my router today, because I did turn on the telnet server and also change the default IP address, but that's all I've done. So this would be essentially the same as if you logged in with your console port. And the first thing we're going to do to configure is just basically the network settings, such as the ports and the default route. And then I'll show you how to do just some basic security things. These things aren't super different than Cisco, but there are some commands that are slightly different. And when you first log in with your console cable, the password is username and password is Cisco, and at that time it'll force you to change your username and password. That's why mine is admin and nothing. So like I said, the first thing we're going to do is just look at our ports, and we'll go through and create a VLAN and set up the ports and then also the default route. And so just so you know, the changes I've already made is I did change my management-vlan IP address. By default, this is 192.168.1.254. In case you have one of these, you would use 1.254 to get into the web interface. You cannot get into either the telnet or SSH by default because neither service is turned on. Okay, so we're going to go and look at the interfaces, and they're just set up as gigabit. In this port, it's gigabit Ethernet 1 through 24. I'm going to ignore my other 4 interfaces for now because I don't have the links for those ports. And I'm just going to show you how easy and quick it is to set this up, and how you can set it up with basically exactly the same commands as you would use on a regular enterprise switch or an older 3600 or whatever 2900 Cisco switch. So the very first thing I'm going to do is just go into the configure terminal mode. I'm going to change my host name really quickly, and I'm just going to call this Cisco 220, the server type. And then, as you would, because I'm connected on port 1 to my router, I want that to be my uplink trunk port. And by default on these small business switches, your interfaces are set up for a trunk. So I'm going to ignore that port for just a second, and we're going to go in and actually set up ports 2 through 24. And just like you would do on a standard Cisco switch, you would just put in your interface. Whoops. We're going to do range actually, because we're going to just configure all of them at once. So we're going to do GI 2 through 24. And I'm not going to use trunks except for on VLAN 1, so all these are just going to be set up as access ports, and you can do this exactly like you would in any other Cisco environment. So we're going to use the switch port mode access, and I'm also going to do set these into VLAN 168. Okay, I made a mistake. Since I haven't added configuration, I have not created that VLAN yet. And unlike an enterprise, if you're used to the enterprise Cisco switches, it'll actually create that VLAN for you. That is not true in the small business. You do have to actually go back and create it. I'll just create a name here called data. And we'll exit back out of that. And we'll bring back up the 24 ports, and we'll add all these to these VLANs to what do I do with the VLAN 168, just to confirm that, just like you would in any other Cisco switch. So you can see by default the first port is actually a trunk, so we can ignore that, but you do see that my VLAN ID is 168 for all my untagged ports. So in other words, anything that leaves the interface that's in VLAN 168 will be untagged and sent out, or anything that comes in that's untagged that comes to that interface right now will also be just tagged as 168 and sent throughout that switch, except for port 1. And we'll also look at configuring port 1, because even though it's a trunk, I want to put, when I do these, I always try to restrict which VLANs I am not using. So, and I'll show you if I do switch port mode trunk, it's not going to change anything because that's the default. But if you were changing it back from an access port, you would have to add that. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I want to do switch port trunk, and we'll allow VLAN. I guess all I need to allow is 168 because only the port I'm using right now is 1. Or VLAN I'm using right now is 1. Where did I goof up here? Oh, sorry, add 68. So that restricts everything down. And in this case, I'm basically already done with configuring those ports. The one thing is, if you want to use something like port fast, you don't want to do a spanning tree, that is something else we could do real quickly. If so, we'll go back in, we'll get back to our range command, and you can also do your spanning tree port fast or link fast or whatever on these. But you'll see that effectively most of the networking now is already done. We have our trunk in place on port 1 that connects back to the router, and all of our other ports are already configured for access ports in the appropriate VLAN, and they're also set up for spanning tree port fast, which means that they'll be instantly up when I plug a device into those ports. The last thing on the networking side that we have to do that we haven't done yet is we have not set up a default gateway for this yet. So I would not be able to log in yet, as you can see from the computer. Since I'm on a separate subnet, at this point I still cannot ping this device. So I would not be able to log in through PuTTY without setting this up. So you can see this doesn't work, so we need to add our IP default gateway. In this case, it's going to be 192.168.2.1. And then at the end you can see it started to work. So this is how I would configure the network if I was in a pure Cisco environment. For those of you that maybe have a mixed environment, say you have a lot of Dell switches or not everything Cisco switches, you may want to use instead of switch port mode access, and trunk like you do in a standard Cisco environment, you may want to use switch port mode general. That is the way, in my experience, most other switch manufacturers do this, and that's because they came into being post the 8021Q standard coming out. I remember Cisco used ISL, so they already kind of had a baseline set up for what kind of commands to use. Now, these commands are basically the same, and like I said, I would recommend what I did the first time if you're in an all Cisco environment. But if you do want to do the general, I'll show you how to do it just on port 2 real quick, and it's exactly the same. So what you do when you do a switch port, so what you would do is you would change your switch port mode to general. And in this case, we want to, there's two commands in general after this. You have your PVID command, your port VLAN ID, which basically is equivalent to the native VLAN in Cisco speak. So in other words, if an untag, it's not exactly the same because the access command in Cisco basically also acts like your native VLAN per access port. So in other words, when an untagged packet comes in, it gets sent to whatever port you've added the VLAN to. That is not true on a general port. So on a general port, to take care of that packet that's coming in, you would say switch port general, and so what you're going to do is you're going to say allow a VLAN, I think it's add 168. Now if you're in Dell world and you hit this, I believe it defaults to untag, but that is not true, at least on the Cisco 220. So you have to add the untag moniker on there, so that the port knows it's not looking for a tagged. If you were to put that in the defaulting on Cisco, it would be looking for tagged traffics like it's coming from a phone instead of the untagged. But since I'm trying to make an equivalent of an access port, we need to give it this untag. So what that is saying is, hey, if I have a packet that's untagged coming from a computer to this port, send it to VLAN 168. We're going to add the 168 tag and just blast it to all those. Now, I'm sorry, if it's I have that backwards. If it's coming from the switch and it's tagged 168, we're going to untag it and send it out of the port. Okay. The opposite is true for the PVID of this port. So in order to make this act just like a standard access interface, this basically is my native VLAN. So when an untagged port packet comes into the switch, I had said this backwards before, you need that. So this command is effectively for untagged traffic. If it comes in, this is basically saying my native VLAN is 168. So if it comes in as untagged, send it to the backplane with a tag of 168, so it gets sent to that VLAN. This command is saying, hey, if I got traffic leaving the port and it's tagged 168, untag it and send it out. So if I do a show VLAN now, okay, notice how it didn't change anything. I'm still included in here because this command effectively, well, the combination of these, but this command is basically placing me in VLAN 168. I hope that makes sense. And so when you do this, if you're in a mixed environment and you're setting up your access ports, you may want to do it this way as opposed to this way. These are exactly the same thing, and you effectively can do the trunks the same way too, except of course this would become a switch. Instead of trunk, it's also used as the general, and there's a allow, you'd say allow VLAN add 168 whatever, tagged or untagged or whatever, however you want to handle your trunks. The general is just a little more specific of how to do things. You have to tell it exactly what you want, so it's a little more flexible. but it's harder in my opinion to set up. It's not as simple. And this will handle 99% of your situations, so I would definitely recommend sticking with this setup. Now, just to go over, this switch now is basically set up to function properly on my network. The management has not been completely set up. For example, in my case, I'm going to want to turn on SSH as part of my locking this down. My HTTPS is already on by default. So the other things I'd probably want to do that are required is set up my time properly. So just like a standard, it's just the clock command. So let's say I want to set up my time zone. I'm trying to remember now. Oh yeah, that's right. So you have to just give it whatever. So I'm in Mountain Time, so I'm just going to call this Mountain Standard Time. And then I believe it's -7, I think. So from my UTP or Greenwich Mean Time, whatever you want to call it, I'm 7 hours. I have to subtract 7 hours off that. And then I also need to tell it, because I live in an area that has daylight savings time. For those of you who live in Arizona or someplace like that, you obviously don't have to do this. I'm just going to tell it USA because I live in the United States. And I'm also going to set up my SMTP server. In this case, this is going to be 2.1. Okay. And finally, now you'll also see, if we do a show run here, that by default, this sets up all kinds of SMTP. I'm in a lab, so none of these are going to work because I don't have internet access. But I do have a time server on my router, so that will allow me to get the time. This might be great already for you, but if you do not allow this on your network, you might have to set it to a local time server, just like I did. So that takes care of your time, and depending on what your security policy is, CDP is on by default. So if you don't want that, of course, you do CDP. I'm sorry. Since we're turning it off, we're going to do no CDP run. So that will turn CDP off. Okay, so we have turned on our SSH. We have turned off our CDP. We've turned on our time. And also requirements, at least for my clients, is that we have to have both a welcome banner and a login banner. Now the login banner would be the banner that comes up pre-logging in. So let's see, so I think it's it might be banner. Oh, okay. So what this is saying is that you're going to have to set your own delimiter. In my case, I'm just going to use a $, doesn't really matter. So let's just say this is my login banner. And then you just have to add your delimiter when you want to end it. And so that would be my original banner, usually the warning. And then if you want to have your welcome banner afterwards, they call it an exec banner in here, but that's the same thing. You would do banner exec. Same thing, so it doesn't, like I said, doesn't matter. We can pick whatever we want. So for that, you have logged in, right? And put my delimiter. And so my two banners are now there. And the last thing that I would say at a minimum that we are required to probably do on this is we need to limit who can access our server with either SSH or whatever. Now, these actually allow security groups and other things. So if you're in a very large institution, you'd probably use those. They allow you to limit this down to IP address and a lot of other things. But for this simple thing, all I'm going to do is restrict access to a couple subnets. And for all the services, whether it's SSH or Telnet or whatever, if you were doing this, you might only want to use SSH, or you might only want to use HTTPS. Then you can change your services to do that. So I'm just going to start out as management access list, and I'm just going to call it management. And we're going to permit, let's see, I'm on the 10.2.2.0 network. Okay, this shows using a wildcard. My experience with small businesses that you never actually use the wildcard. It won't work. Instead, you just use a standard mask. Oops, maybe I'm wrong. Oh, right. So I'm just going to do it by service, and I'm going to do all, because I'm going to allow SSH, HTTPS, whatever. So, but if you only want to allow SSH, for example, you would have just put in SSH or HTTPS or whatever. Okay. And I'm also going to allow the local interface basically off my router. So I'll just do the whole network as well. Okay. So I've restricted everything down to with this ACL, but this has not been applied yet, so I'm still completely wide open. But once it's applied, I basically just restricted everything to those two subnets. And the way you would apply this is just like you would off of your line numbers on an enterprise switch, except you don't do it under the line numbers, is you have to. So what you would do is, again, with the management, you have to add an access class like you would see under your line numbers for your ACL. And the ACL, I called it management. So there you go. I am now restricted. I would not be able to log into this from like 10.3 or whatever. So I think this is kind of the base config. Most would be good enough for most people. It has your banner, has your clock, has all your configuration for your port setup. Also, it is different with these. If you do want to do voice VLANs, you do that not under the interface, but just under the standard ConfT terminal. But it's not very hard to do. I don't have a phone on this, so I won't be doing it. And if you do want to make other changes, such as you do have the line commands here as well. So if you, let's say, for example, you want to change your exact timeout, just call it to 30 minutes or whatever. I think by default it's 10, just to show you. But you do have a choice if you want to keep a history of commands or something, a history number. So we'll say we want to be allowed to have a history of 20, whatever. And so even though a lot of your line stuff is done in the general config, you can do the same thing for, I think it's Telnet, for Telnet or SSH or whatever you want to do. So if I want to change this to 30 minutes, just to show you that there are other we'll do the same for this as well. 30 minutes. Even though that's probably less secure, but it's a lab environment. But hopefully this gave you a good idea of how to configure these. And if you get, the nice thing about this too is if you create a template for this, you can literally configure one of these switches in 5 minutes from the command line. That is not something you can do from the web interface. Although, you know, if you're a real small business, the web interface might make a lot more sense for you, or if you're not familiar with the Cisco commands. I hope this has been beneficial to anyone out there that, like we are, maybe is finding it kind of expensive to stay on the Cisco bandwagon. This is a good way to inexpensively kind of use your prior knowledge and continue to use Cisco devices that are far less expensive. Have a great day.